Hello, everybody. Once again, Joe Nice back again for the live and direct chat series on facebook.com/Joe Nice DJ and on youtube.com/Joe Nice DJ. Proud to be a part of, again, Tastemakers Radio on the Dash Radio networks. You can take a look at the information there, Dash Radio/Tastemakers. You can also follow them on Instagram at Tastemakers_radio and at Dash Radio. We have a very incredibly special guest today, main man Collin Radix-Carter, activist, childhood educator in Washington, D.C., a multinational citizen like yours truly, a comrade in the fights for humanity, freedom, equality, and survival. Collin, how are you, sir?
Not bad. Thank you so much for having me on, Joe.
Absolutely, brother. Absolutely. Tell everybody about yourself. The floor is yours.
Yeah. So as you said, I am early childhood educator, been involved in education now for pushing 20 years now, and lived in DC now for the last 4 years. Prior to that, Boston, and then prior to that, New Jersey, and then the UK, where I was born and raised as a kid. Definitely became more involved in politics since I became a citizen back in 2015. And obviously just being open, just as far as issues pertaining to this country. And I think, especially through my travels, just more interested in what's happening internationally, especially in Africa, where I had the opportunity to live under a study I was doing as a missionary and been able to return to East Africa since my first trip in 2008. And so, yeah, just looking to do my part as far as bringing more of our consciousness and bringing more awareness to, what's happening in the Black community, but I think more especially what's happening in the Black community internationally. Because I feel like that's a topic that we don't talk too much about, especially among the Black community. And I think
Agreed.
there are issues that are intersectional among each other in terms of, just oppression and relation and in connection with that, as far as how we deal with that in the Black community. That's kind of what was the seed that essentially made me decide to start my own YouTube channel where I'm able to discuss those issues and have a forum where I'm able to build a community around those issues.
Okay. Tell everybody about your YouTube channel, please.
So my YouTube channel is called Komawo Mukwano, which is Luganda, which is a tribal Ugandan language meaning come back, beloved, or come back, dear friend. So that's kind of is the name kind of based upon my visits in Uganda and, having spent a decade, there in terms of visiting and living there for 5 months back in 2011.
Sure.
Just really developing a relationship with the people on the ground there. And when I basically returned, which is essentially home at this point, they would call me a Mukwano, dear one, I think in as far as the relationships I've built, but I think for me, especially the relationships I've built, in learning about the country and having a more deepened sense of the country besides just more of a superficial aspect of it as what you would get as a tourist.
Sure.
And so just kind of combining, my love, for the country and then the region in general, but also using it as a way to invite others, especially Black people, especially in the West, to kind of introduce the idea of like, look, there's a lot about Africa, which I think is great, that I think we're beginning to have those conversations a lot more now. But Africa, as you know, is a huge continent. There's over 2,000, cultures within the continent in of itself. And so,
and 54 countries.
What's that?
In 54 countries.
Yeah. And that's not to say we're going to learn every single one, but there's a spectrum of thought and belief that I think we only aspect on a certain part of it most often than not.
Of course.
So just kind of expand the conversation a little more, just to kind of have more inclusion as far as how others think. And I think especially in East Africa, where we don't really hear a lot about that region at all. We tend to hear a lot about mostly what's happening in West Africa, which makes sense given our history, and then South Africa also makes sense,
Of course.
but not so much, in the East, um, Rwanda, Burundi, Kenya, all those regions within the East African region that don't often get highlighted. So it's just a way for me to kind of share an aspect of a part of the continent that doesn't get much love, and to kind of bring in the conversation as far as how can we, make that part of the conversation as far as how can we, living in the West, be more inclusive in thought as far as thinking in terms of, what do we know about Africa that kind of pertains to our issues here? And
Sure.
collectively within the diaspora, what can we do collectively among the Black community to kind of support each other in light of these issues?
That makes perfect sense. And I'm appreciative of everything you just said, Colin, because it's not only, and this is kind of to add to what you were saying earlier, it's not only just Black people across the diaspora with respect to just Black people living in the United States and Black people in Africa. This is also the Caribbean diaspora, because I know you also have a Caribbean connection, much like I do. My parents were born in Trinidad. I think your parents were born in Barbados, if I'm not mistaken.
My dad, and then my mom's side is also from Trinidad.
Your mom's from Trinidad, dad's from Barbados. You're a citizen here, born in England. You see, that's interesting. Yeah, because my parents born in Trinidad. I was also born in England, grew up here in the United States. So yeah, so that's amazing. So between us, we've got a lot of passports, and we're just really just untouchable. So we can go to wherever we want, just get in whatever country we want. Passports,
and
we're good to go.
and I think definitely in a lot of ways, and I think this was an issue for me growing up in feeling like different, even among the Black community, just as far as
Yes.
not necessarily thinking the way that an African American would.
Yes.
Which growing up, I always thought like that was a problem. But I think the beauty of it, especially now being able to travel outside, as an adult, just being able to have the awareness of people think differently. And I think I've been able to be more sensitive to that as far as how I'm able to kind of look at different opinions and being able to kind of see that perspective in light of my own life and then my own upbringing. So again, I think, we need to talk about that more, I think, in connection to, the community, because we often think, and we've heard this, even in our political spectrum, that, the Black people are a monolith, like alluding to it,
yes,
which is not true.
It's not true at all.
And I think especially among the Black community, we need to also be conscious of that,
I agree.
that like in this country, it's not just African American, it's people like us who happen to have some ties to Caribbean, and in our case, Europe, in addition to Africans, born and raised, even in addition to Afro-Australians or whatever else, that also we need to be included. So again, my idea for the channel is just to bring more of a spectrum of thought across different regions in the world. But I think especially with that section in East Africa, where we almost never hear their perspective on anything, but to kind of bring them into the conversation as far as their beliefs, their way of thinking, and how that ties to issues that pertain to our issues that we kind of talk about.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And it's interesting because I know earlier in the conversation you said that you grew up in England, and then you came here at I guess an older age than I did, because I was born in England, but I didn't grow up there. I came to the United States when I was about a year and a half, almost 2 years old. You came to this country, I think, when you were about 10 or 11?
11, yeah.
11. Okay. So the growing up aspect for you would have been different because you grew up essentially as a Black British person. Then you come to America and you still have all of the cultural attachments of being a Black British person, but now you're just a Black person living in the United States. And all of the cultural implications of that are you face discrimination from not only Black Americans, but
Mhm.
you're still going to face this typical discrimination that you would face from white Americans
Yeah.
because, oh, you're not white, you're
Yeah.
Black. But then the discrimination that you would receive from Black Americans is, well, wait a minute, you're Black, but you're not a Black American. You're not quote unquote Black enough. And
Yeah.
I've received that. I understand what that feels like, and it's a shame that people like ourselves have to deal with that sort of discrimination simply because we don't fit into the stereotypical
Yeah.
box of being quote unquote Black, and the implications of being quote unquote Black meaning just only Black American, which goes back to that monolithic line of thinking you alluded to a few
Yeah.
minutes ago.
Absolutely. That was definitely my experience. I came to this country basically as a middle schooler.
Yep.
So obviously
Oh,
that in of itself brings in a lot can of worms,
oh
just those
gosh.
growing pains,
Yes.
just growing into yourself as adult. But then for me, the extra bonus of growing into what it means to live in a country that was somewhat foreign to me, permanently. And
Hell, not somewhat, was foreign.
yeah,
It's a different
I'm
country.
saying somewhat only because like I came for visits prior to.
I
So the
understand.
idea
Yes.
of coming to America wasn't a new thing, but to actually live here was. But having the reality of realizing that very, abruptly that even and to be fair, like we were kids, so they wouldn't necessarily known any better.
Yeah.
But the idea that I wasn't necessarily accepted, because I spoke differently, I fought differently, and I may not necessarily have been was kind of readily, open, to the idea of, American culture at least then
Mhm.
was very eye-opening to me then,
Yes.
and I think, unfortunately, the message that I was getting at that time was, "We don't care how you think, you have to assimilate to our culture," which at the time, I felt like it was something that I kind of had to do, and even my mom, I think, in her way was trying to help me feel a little bit more comfortable in just trying to be here. So she helped me to adapt as far as, buying the certain clothes, early 90s. So everything was kind of more of the baggy style. So, trying to, get
Yeah.
into that, and like unintentionally, whatever, but losing my British accent, over the course of, several years.
Sure, of
But
course.
but now looking back, I'm just kind of like, well, why? I just felt that was very unfair, instead of like I had to kind of make these changes for you, and you weren't willing to make those changes for me. You
Right.
weren't willing to accept me as I am,
Mhm.
and
Exactly.
so which I think again kind of translates into for me traveling. I think being very conscious in as far as the space that I'm in, the people
Yes.
that I'm with,
Mhm.
that I'm not gonna come in and kind of be like, "Oh, I am from the West, so I'm gonna come in and I expect you to, bow down to me and just kind of
Yes.
divert to my way of thinking." No.
Mhm.
And I think especially going to Uganda when I had the privilege of living there for 5 months, the idea that I had in my mind was, no, I'm coming in as a learning opportunity.
Yes.
Like I want to be able to learn from people that I otherwise may not be able to meet, that having them tell me, what they believed and how they think. And and I found that in my experience, it was a mutual exchange. And it was tough, obviously, like
Sure.
a lot of it dealing with especially with the group of children that I was working with at the time, and many of them were teenagers at that point. Um, they were trying to figure me out in terms of my connection to the continent, so
Yeah.
they initially thought that I was a Ugandan who was adopted by a white family who, who was shipped off to America, you
Mhm.
know. Which I was kinda like, "No," but
No.
it makes sense given, their perspective, that's what they saw. That was what they saw within their community that there will be them, Ugandan who people of color will come in and adopt them and send them to their home countries. So that's kind of where that association came with me. And basically having to kind of give them a kind of a crash course of, you know, African, diaspora history in terms of the Atlantic slave trade and all that, and how that made sense in connection to my personal history, which in East Africa, and just looking at their textbooks that they had, it's not, they kind of breeze through that, so again, I think this is kind of where there may be that point of contention, I think, especially among some African communities, because they generally do not know this information.
Right,
And so the
right,
idea of me as a Black person being able to say, hey, this is kind of our reality, but this is how I came to be in terms of, my
your
connection to the
identity,
West,
of
you
course.
know, um, I was happy that I was able to highlight that for them. And I think just in really realizing that there needs to be more people like me who will be willing to go over and kind of share that,
Right,
because they don't often get that perspective at all.
right. And you know what, and you know, Kyle, that makes so much sense that the children would see you as potentially being maybe just adopted by a white family and then coming over, because and this is maybe a bit of a long explanation, but it's going to make sense. My ex-wife is a white lady, and she grew up predominantly teaching Black children,
Right.
and most of the, I guess, NGOs or humanitarian people that you see in certain parts of Africa are primarily white people, mostly white women.
Yeah.
And natural, and if you think about, this goes to a conversation that Kat and I had in one of our previous episodes. We talked about the two most powerful unions in the United States are the police unions and teachers unions.
Yeah.
And teachers unions are primarily made up of middle class white women.
Yeah.
The police unions are primarily made up of middle class white men.
Yeah.
And if you think about the humanitarian efforts that you see in Africa, especially when you talk about medical care, when you talk
Mhm.
about certainly education, it's there. You have a bunch of Black faces, Black children seeing mostly white women helping them learn how to read and learning about
Exactly.
African history. So
Exactly.
then when they see an educated brother like yourself come over, they're looking at you like a unicorn. They're like, well, who the
Yeah.
hell is this?
Exactly.
Where's Stacy?
Yeah.
Where's
Exactly.
Jennifer?
Yeah.
Right? Where's Michelle? Whoa, whoa, whoa. Colin?
Yeah.
And you're Black? And you're
Right.
a teacher? And
Yeah.
you're a guy?
Yeah.
Right? Because I can speak to this with a little bit of expertise. Again, just being married and to an educator in Baltimore City. There's there is something to a Black male teacher, and you just don't see many of them.
Yeah.
And it becomes even more of a rarity in terms of executive leadership at schools and in the highest levels of the federal government with respect to education. Take a look at the previous secretaries of education, Arnie Duncan notwithstanding, but most of them have been women. If you take a look at the previous heads of the National Education Foundation or the NEA, I think it's called, they're
Mhm.
mostly women, mostly white women. If you take a
Yeah.
look at many of the principals that you see in our schools, it's mostly white women. So the fact that you went over there to teach children about African history and you had to make more of an effort to validate yourself to your own people. It really speaks to how endemic and systemic white supremacy truly is.
Mhm.
When you, a Black person, a son of that country,
Yeah.
has to put in more energy and effort to prove
Yeah.
yourself to your own people.
Yeah. You just spoke to a huge problem that, and again, I it's great for me to haven't gone to that East Africa more than once,
Yes.
because the more that I've gone, the more I've been able to think about this stuff a lot more. It just kind of deepened, my questions and my wonderings, each time that I go. And the first time I went in 2008, but I lived there like for the program that I was in 2011. And when I came back in 2014 for a short visit to Uganda, those were the questions that I was starting to ask because, I basically went in as a missionary um, back into 20, both like those times prior. And then I would kind of had the idea of being like, a lot of the missionaries I saw, and to be fair, like if you're called to do stuff like that, great. But then I kind of asked, where are the Black missionaries? And I actually asked the CEO of the organization that I was affiliated with at that time that question. And funny enough, he had the same wondering too, because he kind of asked me back, like, I don't know. I was hoping you would have a better idea,
Mhm.
um, of what's going on here. So if a white man is able to kind of acknowledge that and kind of ask me about it, then I think that kind of speaks to, that lack of representation that I think we have, collectively internationally.
Yes.
Um, but then like how that translates into, and just give you another example, when I went to Kigali, Rwanda, in 2019, that was my first time going. My close friend, who I met in Uganda, who lives there now, he took me outside the city. And Kigali is very interesting because often when you think of Africa in terms of like layout, you think of the city, which is like a typical African city. And then like outside it, you think of like the bush, basically. That's
Sure.
how you would typically think of it. Kigali is very interesting in that you have the city center, and then on the outskirts of it, literally like you can drive like 20 minutes, and then you're basically in the bush, which was kind of interesting. But he took me to an area within that region where he's ministering. So I sat in, a woman's house, and had fellowship with them. Basically he led a Bible study there. And then after that, he opened the opportunity for them to ask me questions since, I was visiting, and they were very grateful, that I came in to visit. But one of the things that they were surprised at was basically they kind of said that it's easier for them to kind of recognize that white people live in the West versus someone like me,
Mhm.
which makes sense because when you talk about, a lot of missionaries or even like tourists in East Africa in particular, who do you see more often than not?
White
You'll
folks.
see not just white folks, you'll see Indians, you'll see Chinese, you'll see
Yes.
Arabs,
Yes.
and not us more often than not.
Let me rephrase that. Non-Black people.
Non-Black, non-Black Westerners,
Yes.
often do not, we have an extremely low, like next to no turnout. And so, and again, that's kind of why that was kind of like the idea, in the sense of wanting to, well, initially I wasn't even thinking about doing a YouTube channel. I was actually thinking of doing like a clothing line similar to yours.
Mm.
I'm still gonna do that, but then like when I talked to Jackson Hinkle, who I got connected with before Seville, and he actually stayed with me,
Yep.
like during that time while he was in DC. And him being a YouTuber under a year at that point, I asked him, like, I kind of pitched my idea. And then he was just like, yeah, you definitely should do it because no one is necessarily even talking about these issues at
Yep.
all.
Yep.
And then talking to other, indie YouTubers like Franco Analysis, and then some other people within those communities like Ali Alexandra and others, Mona
Richie Medhurst.
really matters as well. And actually, in a lot of ways, yeah, Richie actually kind of inspired me in a lot of
Yeah.
ways too. Actually, being from Syria and speaking from
4
that Syrian
languages.
perspective, in
Yes.
terms of giving more perspective in terms of how Syrians think. In terms of what's happening in the Middle East and how our imperialism is affecting, his family. So Richie and Lovely's also in time inspired me as well. you
Yeah.
know.
And his
So
parents were aid workers for the Peace Corps, the UN, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah, so
Yeah.
just kind of realizing, I think especially when we think of imperialism slash media, how much so much of the narrative that they control, that the idea that a Rwandan or Ugandan person can easily make the association of, oh, a white person lives in America and is able to kind of travel to, to that region to work and live,
Right.
and not someone like us,
Right. Right.
so which I think is, i- i- I think, in my opinion, is just a sad state of affairs in a
I
lot of
agree.
ways.
I agree. And this, I guess, further highlights the importance of your channel because when, and we're coming up next month, will be 402 years since the first Africans were trafficked from present day Angola and brought to an area known as Point Pleasant, Virginia, which is now known as Fort Monroe, Virginia. I plan on driving out to Fort Monroe, Virginia on August 20th again. I did it
Mhm.
last year and I plan on doing it again this year. Because last year there was supposed to be some sort of commemorative activities involved in that area, but it didn't happen because of COVID.
Right.
Since the COVID restrictions have been eased a little bit, I think there will be something there this year. So I definitely plan on driving out to the Hampton Roads, Virginia area and seeing what's going on there on August 20th. But when the first Africans were essentially taken from Africa and brought to the present day United States, the and then when you think about colonialism between the six countries that basically divided up Africa, France, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, and
Okay.
Germany, and the UK, obviously, of course, obviously
Right.
the UK, that essentially divided up Africa. The the psychological connection for people from in the African diaspora that now live in North America was essentially destroyed. It was destroyed. And a couple of weeks back, I had my friend Donna Al Hassan. She's a Palestinian activist and
Yeah.
educator here.
Yeah. I
And
saw
we,
that.
yeah, and we,
Spectacular documentary.
yeah, and she and I talked about how she mentioned how in Palestine, she knows where her people came from in Palestine because the homes where they lived, the communities in which they lived, there's a historical record and a historical connection with people from Palestine and the generational descendancy of the people from that area to now. With Africans, especially
Hmm.
African Americans or people from the Caribbean diaspora like you and me, or people who are black that have a European connection, like coincidentally you and me, the psychological connection with Africa has been disintegrated because of colonialism, capitalism, imperialism, white supremacy. And that's probably the reason why it's easier for white people to go to certain parts of Africa and gain acceptance because, quite honestly, it's their ancestors that split up Africa and took it for their own personal and professional profit.
Yeah.
While people that look like us came from that area, were trafficked to other areas around the world, and then had to assimilate to a new culture that wasn't particularly or necessarily ours historically.
Yeah. I mean, when I lived in Uganda, within the first month
Mm-hmm.
of me connecting with the children that I was mentoring, because obviously they were still trying to make sense of who I was. Um, and one of the first questions, if not the first question that they asked me was, "Uncle, where are you from?" And obviously, like I told them, oh, I was born in UK, but my family's from the Caribbean, and then now I live in the States or whatever. But they kept asking, no, where are you from? Where are you from? And initially I was getting very angry because I'm like, I told you where I'm from, you know.
Right.
But then I realized, oh, they mean where am I from in terms of the continent?
Your
And
background.
my home, as in,
Yes.
my roots, so to speak.
Correct.
And not to say that I never had thought about, that question beforehand, but I think that time I was forced to kind of think about, why don't I know that? And so I remember, when I left after my stint was over, like I
Mhm.
remember saying to myself, I am not returning to the continent again until I know, obviously you're not going to know names, which again speaks to how white supremacy has essentially destroyed, our lineage, because we have no idea, you
Right.
know, but you can find out collectively which region in Africa you're from up until maybe what tribe you belong to. That
Mhm.
you can do.
Sure.
So it made me take I took one, I think maybe 3 years ago, that just kind of confirmed, like where my family is from, both sides. But, but I took one that was specific to which tribe, I belong to, which
Mhm.
is Igbo and Yoruba on my dad's side, and then Masa, which is on my mom's side, which is connected to Cameroon,
Yes.
on my mom, at least on my mom's side, and there's probably going to be a lot more, like on my uh, grandfather, my mom's side, that I'm sure there's going to be a lot more of a mix there
Of course.
that I don't know yet.
Right.
But one thing I definitely
And again,
noticed,
because your mother's from
especially,
Trinidad, and Trinidad obviously has a, a highly diversified population, not
right?
only with Black Africans, but also Eastern Indians.
Yeah.
There's a large Eastern Indian population in Trinidad. In fact, my father is biracial, but
Mhm.
there's a biracial categorization that most people are not familiar with, known as Dougla,
Yeah.
Dougla. I know you would know about this because your mother's from Trinidad. Dougla is somebody who has an African parent and an Eastern Indian parent.
Yeah.
My so realistically, my grandmother on my father's side was of Eastern Indian descent.
Yeah.
Wore
Yeah.
sarongs,
And
binto, everything.
yeah, I mean,
Practice
a lot
Hindu.
of my cousins on my mom's side are half Indian.
Yeah. Hmm.
So, um, but what I noticed when I was in Uganda, which I thought was very interesting, even though that many of them, were orphaned or whatever, or living at the children's center that I was working at due to various reasons, each of them were able to tell me which tribe they were from, and that gave them a sense of pride and a sense of belonging in terms of, culture, customs, in many cases, language,
Hmm.
like that they were able to hold on to, even though there's maybe issues within their nuclear family,
Yes,
but they felt that belonging in terms of tribally, that they felt that belonging.
of course.
We don't have that, unfortunately,
Nope.
in the West anymore
Nope.
because due to the isms that you already described, and so and I think in terms of my hope, like is to kind of have that conversation as far as, again, come back, beloved, come back, dear friend, reconnect to the idea of the cultures and the languages that you may have lost, but at the same time, just having the idea of, you know, and this is definitely something I'm going to talk about on my channel as far as, like this quote unquote beef among Africans and then like Western blacks, basically, just, and it's true,
It
there's definitely
exists.
some truth to that. But, and I think this will definitely be kind of like a deep dive thing because I know it's very nuanced issue, but
Yeah.
but at the same time, again, Black people are not a monolith.
Yes.
So it's not a very fair stance to kind of say that all Africans think that, African Americans are a certain way and vice versa. And at least I could say for me, that wasn't my experience, traveling, and living in East Africa.
Mhm.
Again, I had to have the mindset of, I'm coming in your space, I'm a guest in your house.
Yes.
So I am going to listen and use this opportunity to learn and observe and definitely ask questions, but I
Exactly.
am in your spot.
Exactly.
So you're going to be the ones to guide me through
Exactly.
this. And I think coming in with that attitude, the people at least I met were extremely receptive of that,
Mm.
you know. But what I found was they had a better understanding of me in terms of now, to be fair, given our unique experience, given the regions of the world where, we are based, it's
Yes,
going to be slightly different
of
versus what an
course.
African American would experience. But
Absolutely.
at least they've had the context of knowing, you know, a different way of thinking versus maybe a white person would have shared,
True.
and I think obviously for me, and I think especially now many of the people that I know are now adults and I can share a lot more and they see the internet, so they see a lot more. Like, for example, when George Floyd, that issue went down last year, the first people that contacted me were my friends in Uganda. And they asked me, is everything okay? Are you okay? And the
Yeah.
first of all, I was like, you actually saw what happened because obviously internet over there is kind of spotty at best. But
Yeah.
the fact that they saw that, I was kind of like, good. I'm glad you did because this is the kind of stuff that I was trying to tell you for years, but you never really had the connection or the experience to kind of really know what I was saying as far as racism, in this country, which they didn't get. Well, they're not going to get that because in terms of how they think, they may have issues tribally, but not issues due to race.
Correct.
That's going to be a different, conversation altogether. But it did lead to conversations that I had with them since then, and fortunately, I was able to kind of share, my issue, with race in this country prior to, but then they kind of made it and had it kind of clicked for them just as far as, oh, this is what you were talking about all those
Right.
years. And
Right.
we didn't understand,
Right.
but now we have an idea
Right.
of what that implication of being Black means,
Absolutely.
being in the West.
Right. Question for you from JC in the chat, and we want to bring this up and out to JC every single time. One of our
Mm.
favorite people. She says here, "What do you guys make of the charity tourism?" Let me rephrase that. What do you guys make of the quote charity tourism end quote concept in Africa or whatever it is called? And Atres later on in the chat calls it voluntourism. So, your thoughts, please, sir.
Um, we kind of talked about this, and I think I actually mentioned this on our last stream with Jackson,
Yes,
in
I remember
connection
this.
to, you know, in knowing what, like we talked about, Kagame's quote unquote apology to Rwanda in their connection to the genocide.
It was actually Emmanuel Macron's
Oh yeah,
apology.
yeah. And
Paul Kagame in Rwanda.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah. And
which wasn't
And
much of an
so
apology, by the
I
way.
actually asked Ronnie, if you're watching, shout out to you. He's in Kigali, like my friend in Kigali. I asked him, and my other contact in Rwanda, Peter, if there's anything what do you think you need as a nation? What do you need the most? Um, and one of the things that they told me was economic empowerment.
Mm,
Sound familiar?
of course, reparations. No different than what's happening with Black Americans
Exactly.
in the United States or what CARICOM is working on with their 10-point reparations plan for Caribbean nations.
Right. And so I personally have an issue with that concept because, and this is going to sound stereotypical, but it's often like thought about like, when like anyone from the West goes to Africa, one of the things, especially if you develop relationships with them, they're going to ask you for things. They might ask you for money, they might ask you for clothes, they might ask you for certain things. And I think obviously just due to the infrastructures not necessarily being there
Mhm.
is true that I think especially if you're relatively poor in the country, yeah, there's going to be, there's going to be that need there. But we're not necessarily having the conversation of why is it that a young East African might feel that they have to travel out of their own countries and go to Dubai or go to Turkey or go to Europe or go to the States in order to feel like they're going to make it. Because that is an issue that often I hear about, from the youth, in Rwanda and Uganda, that the infrastructure is not there for them as far as being able for them to thrive in those countries.
Sure.
We don't have that conversation, at all. It's often easier to kind of think of, oh, I can just give, my money and some clothes and my time and whatever else and have it be on done with. And that's not what they need. They need the infrastructure to be in place where, as I said, they're able to thrive. And again, these are exactly the same conversations that we're having in the West in terms of reparations. And like, we often think of reparations, which is such a right-wing talking point as far as give Black people money. No, we're not talking about money. We want to be able to have the infrastructure available to us where we're not dependent on, the elites or white supremacy or whatever, just within that culture, or at least that systematic racism that exists in the West, where we're able to kind of take care of things on our own. And that's the issues that I don't think are talked about too often in Africa, that I think also should be highlighted. So while short term, sure, I can kind of understand it, and I think there's definitely room for that. But I think a bigger discussion should be, how can we assist, and how can we in the West, Black people in the West, assist our African cousins to develop that infrastructure where they're not dependent on, the West kind of having their foot in to kind of exploit them again.
Right.
That they are truly free as
Right.
far as having them be able to kind of work on all these systems on their own.
Right. And there's an interesting documentary, and as I'm sure you know, and a few of the viewers and listeners might already know, I have a couple of master's degrees. One of them is in nonprofit management from the University of Baltimore. And during one of the classes I had to take, it was the concepts of nonprofit organizations. I had to watch a documentary on Netflix called Poverty Inc. And when I watched that documentary, I truly realized how much bullshit is actually in a lot of NGOs and INGOs and a lot of our nonprofit organizations, because many of them are not interested in actually solving problems.
Yeah.
Many of them are not interested in making, for example, in Africa, that many of them are not interested in truly uplifting African nations that need help. And the biggest type of help is economic development and economic empowerment. Yeah. Many of them are more interested in, I guess, from using a medical analogy, just treating the illness without curing the disease. And we're seeing that a lot in Africa. And quite honestly, that sort of intersectionality is prevalent in the United States. Take a look at policing. When we talk about policing in the United States, we want to say, oh, let's go ahead and have this bill to protect a certain group of people, or this bill to protect a certain group of people. But instead of actually looking at the root causes as to why we actually need to have these rules in place, or why we need police at all. You see what I'm saying? And when you think about, and I know we want to get to the whole Cori Bush stuff in a little bit, because there's a lot to dive into that. But when you think about the sort of intersectionality with Western nations and European nations and what's happened in Africa, there's really not much difference between, for example, Paul Biya, who is the long-time leader of Cameroon, and let's say Yoweri Museveni in Uganda, and let's say Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus. There's really not much difference between Cyril Ramaphosa, who's the current leader of South Africa, and let's say Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil.
Yeah.
If you think about it from a historical perspective, there's really not much difference between the sort of arrogance of a Barack Obama, who's written 3 autobiographies, and now has a 4th one in the books, in the works, and the former longtime leader of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, who bankrupted the country. And then, if most people don't know or even remember this, the former capital of of Kazakhstan was a city named Astana, Astana. He, Nursultan Nazarbayev, changed the capital of the country to his first name, Nur Sultan. You can go ahead and look it up. And when you think about many of the war criminals that we've seen come from Africa, like a Dominic Ongwen or Joseph Kony, there's no historical difference between them and their crimes against humanity and like a Radovan Karadzic or a Slobodan Milosevic in the former Yugoslavia.
Or Joe Biden.
I was just getting ready to say, or Naftali Bennett, or Mohammed bin Salman, or any president of the United States, or any CIA official or Department of Defense official that we've seen over the past 60, 70, or 80 years. Right. So again, that sort of intersectionality between Africa and the rest of the world. I mean, when you have this sort of power vacuum and this sort of lack of leadership, you end up with leadership like oh gosh, what's the guy's name? Oh gosh, I can't remember the guy's name. Franjo Tuđman in Croatia. You end up with you end up with Omar al-Bashir in Sudan. You end up with the guy who always wears the cowboy hat in South Sudan. And I forget the brother's name. I can't remember the guy's name. You end up with Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. You end up with a Donald Trump in the United States. And you end up with what's currently happening in Tunisia right now with, what's the guy's name? Kais Saied, who essentially has turned over the entire government, fired all of the ministers, and essentially suspended parliament for 30 days. So again, what you see in Africa is not solely limited to Africa, because when you see it happen in Africa, you've seen it reflected in other parts of the world. It just has a different name and a different face, right, but the pathologies remain the same.
Right. And we were talking about this before we went live, I think, just as far as the Somalia airstrikes, which are illegal.
Yes. Well, yes, they are.
I'm sure people in the chat are very aware of this. And then, you know, Ilhan Omar's response via letter to Biden, you know, which actually I was kind of looking at today. But if you look at what we did, you know, this country did in terms of that airstrike, number one, you know, that was an illegal airstrike, you know? So what is Ilhan going to do, you know, now in connection to her homeland?
I agree.
You know? And then I would also make the argument, like, aren't Somalians due for reparations in what happened to them just now? In the same way of, you know, Macron given, you know, that apology to Rwanda. Now, to be fair, and I want to be extremely fair, Kagame has done a lot, you know, for the country, you know, after the genocide. But I also do feel like he has one foot as far as with his people and one foot connected to, you know, the West and what they're able to offer him. And my issue with Kagame was very tepid response to Macron.
Yes.
As far as, you know, I would have gone harder. I would have been like, France, you owe us reparations too. You know? So kind of like, you kind of see it, you know, with Omar, you kind of see it, I think, more recently, you know, like with Macron, Kagame. We also see it like more directly over the weekend with Cori Bush.
Wow.
You know, like as far as her symbolic appearance at the March for Medicare for All, you know. So, but yeah, but I think especially how it ties to Black issues. And this is kind of what my frustration is with, not necessarily just African Americans, but I'm hearing this a lot from African Americans, that like reparations, oh, that's an African American issue. We don't need your help as, you know, an international Black person to kind of help us with that. You take care of, you know, your country within the Caribbean or in Europe, and we got it here. And my argument is,
how's that worked out for you?
If the UK, if something happens within the UK, for example, that they're able to get reparations, you know, for Black people there, wouldn't it be your best interest as African Americans to kind of see, oh, they were able to do this. How are we able to kind of push that narrative over here?
Perfect.
You
I
know,
agree.
so it's in our best interest to be collected in that issue
I thoroughly agree.
um, because collectively we're able to make a bigger stand versus what we're able to do kind of regionally, you know, just due to the areas of the world that we're in.
Mhm.
And it makes us more unified just as a Black community in general.
Right.
But you're just kind of seeing a lot of these symbolism, you know, among our leaders. And I think, you know, especially given, you know, what we see in Africa, you can kind of make the assumption of what you're seeing in the West too.
Right.
So,
There's strength in numbers, obviously,
yeah,
and you know, you and the reparations, you you make more of an impact when you move as a fist rather than fingers,
right,
and it's
right.
that sort of ideology. We have about 9 minutes left, and I wanted to spend the rest of these 9 minutes talking about Cori Bush
Yeah,
and the situation on Saturday.
yeah,
I mean, I was there, you were there. Um, there was a bunch of us that were there, and at first, Dr. Joe Jarvis was speaking, and I was like, okay, who is this lady? Why is everybody taking pictures with her? Then I was like, oh, it's Cori Bush. Okay. She showed up. And
right.
I delivered my speech earlier on, and I said, we were talked about 6.5 months ago, forced to vote, how nobody showed up, no politician showed up. And then out of nowhere, Cori Bush just showed up a couple of hours later after we had already marched around. And I purposely took a picture with her, and I did it on purpose, not because I was enamored with her celebrity. I took a picture of her with her so I could kind of get close and ask a question or two. And the first question I asked her, and her chief of staff, big boy, you remember him,
Yeah,
big dude. He had on some Reeboks, some dad jeans, and a plaid shirt, and he was about 6'6", looked like he played offensive line in college, right? And I remember, and I asked her, and I said, "What?" I said, hey, Cori, how'd you find out about this? How'd you find out? Right? Because I didn't want to confront her like, I wanted to ease into it because, and I can say this to you and anybody else that's watching, Black women on Capitol Hill face more disrespect than anybody. The last thing they need is to get publicly disrespected by another Black person.
right.
So I wasn't going to go there with Cori, but I was going to ask her some questions to really find out what she was about. But I wanted to ease into it. So the first question I asked her was wait, hey, Cori, thanks for showing up. How'd you find out about us? And she said, oh, well, I was scrolling on Twitter and I saw that you all are having a march around the corner. Lie number one. Lie number one.
Right.
Because Twitter was actively suppressing anything involving Medicare for all. Any of the hashtags, any posts, they were actively suppressing everything that was taking place on Saturday. So there's a really good chance she did not see that on Saturday on Twitter. Then the next thing I said was, I didn't even ask her. The next thing she said was, yeah, nobody told me about this. No one reached out. Come
Another
on.
lie.
That's a total lie. Total lie. Because I know for a fact between Ricky, Sharif, Joy, Edie, Joni, a bunch of us reached out to a whole bunch of people in Congress, and not one of them returned any of our phone calls or our emails. None of them returned any of our phone calls or emails. So don't lie to my face and tell me that nobody contacted you. And then before that, tell me to my face that you saw this on Twitter, you saw it trending on Twitter, and you decided to come over.
And I wanted to clarify something because I got not too much, but some heat in thinking like people were calling me, oh, you're a drifter because you took a picture with Cori Bush and whatever else. First of all, and you know this because we talked about it right immediately. I told you right that this is a photo
op. You told that to me.
And like we know this, but
real quick, something else I wanted to say real quick about the photo, and I know you kind of were on the same thing too. The reason I took a photo and posted it, and I removed it from my Instagram about a day later, because I wanted to see if she was actually going to say something such as, oh, hey, I support Medicare for all, or hey, thanks for having me. Or if she was just going to reply and say, hey, you know what, Joe, you're a really handsome brother. and you took a nice something, anything.
Right.
And I got nothing from Cori Bush.
Right.
Nothing. Not even, hey, the bottled waters were cold. Thanks for having me over.
Right.
Or I support Medicare for all. And the lack of response that she gave me and everybody else that took a picture with her on that Saturday is emblematic of everything that she's been about since she stepped into the calls of Congress on January 3rd and January 4th of this year.
The fact that, and I posted my picture, this, and I know people who I know who have bigger followings than me helped to retweet it. And for me, it went viral. Like it went, I think right now it's currently up to like 1,600 likes or something like that.
Oh, that's viral.
Since Saturday.
You, brother. Look at this guy.
And when Joy, I think texted the next day, like, hey, Cori, I noticed that you didn't mention anything about the march, like after the fact or your presence there. By then, I had accumulated this amount, slightly less by then, and I was able to kind of add to her thread.
Yeah.
Cori, this has gone viral. Like, people are talking about my picture I took with you.
You better say something.
Are you going to say something as far as the march? So no, we weren't drifting. Like, you took your fight personally to Cori. I took my fight personally on Twitter, as far as, like, because they knew about this for months, but then also, as I said to you, this is a receipt, because if you came in, and I'm hearing
Medicare for all. That's what she talked about.
Right.
She's a nurse by trade.
And I mean, like, because I'm hearing, like, like, I think Kyle Kalinske, because I watched his response, and mostly after watching the whole thing, like, I agree with mostly what he said, but a part of what he said was, like, you cannot get angry. Like, I think he's kind of assuming, like, a lot of the response that was coming back and forth, just as far as the spot not turning, is anger. No, it's not anger. It's accountability. If you're going to show up for... Now, to be fair to her, thank you for coming, because I've been able to see over the last few months how Sharif, Ricky, Joy, and other organizers have been speared endlessly in light of the march, by some trolls online. So the fact that she came and validated, the marches, thank you. We appreciate that.
Yep.
But moving forward,
that's not good enough.
Moving forward, what are you going to do? Like, force the vote? You had your chance to push the narrative in the middle of a pandemic, and you chose not to do it.
Yep.
You bring it to the floor in March, which was actually, I had to check, was the last time she mentioned about Medicare for all, when they had no leverage at all.
None.
And now you come to this March seemingly due to just hearing about it, when
Twitter.
people have contacted you for months about it.
Come on.
No.
Lies.
Like,
lies.
No. So from now, it's like, if anything, my picture kind of represents go harder on the squad. Because, and people are like, oh, why aren't you going against, like, Manchin and all that kind of stuff? We already know they don't want Medicare for all, so I'm not going to deal with anything from them.
Exactly.
We're going to go after the people that are seemingly closer to us ideologically and politically, and we have more hope for them. So they ran on Medicare for all. So we're going to be hardest on the ones that we care about. That's the saying.
Exactly.
So
we got a minute left, brother.
Yeah.
We got a minute left.
But yeah, that's all I got to say.
Yeah. I mean, quite honestly, given what we both saw, and again, I wasn't nearly as vocal as the other guy who was there. What was his name?
Cody.
Cody. I wasn't nearly as vocal as him in terms of confronting Cori Bush, but I got the answers that I wanted out of Cori. And she didn't even know that she got finessed by me. She didn't know it. And there's an old saying, those that don't get it, don't get that they don't get it. And she doesn't get it. She missed the point and the target of Saturday. And quite honestly, as far as I'm concerned, there's no real discernible difference between her and Maxine Waters.
No.
There really isn't.
Which really I think is very disappointing, given how quickly she kind of bent her knee.
Exactly. Exactly.
But I think it's just more of a case for us to push harder. That's all.
So couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. Collin, this was enlightening, and I'm appreciative of our brotherhood and our friendship. And thank you so much for the time today. We have about 15 seconds.
Yeah, just guys, thank you so much. And I'm
Yeah,
sure Joe's going to share my channel out and
already
watch
did.
it. And when it comes out, and yeah, we'll continue conversation.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Peace.
Bye.